that the editor decides she wants to leave in.
Great. Oh, good.
What I like to do, even though this is a podcast, so it's obviously audio, I like to make the video available because some people, especially now, like to see people's lips moving because we don't get to see that much right now.
That's right.
It's funny. I find myself smiling at people and I'm thinking, they can't see me smiling. I have my mask on all the time,
They can feel it. They can feel it.
Yeah.
My oldest daughter, they say she smiles with her eyes. So
It's the only appendage or whatever you want to call it that we have to smile with sometimes now.
Yeah.
So again, thanks really so much for being here. I watched a few of your clips, and I'm really impressed with the way you get your point across, the way you get people excited about things, the way you get the crowd involved, the way you engage people. It's really nice. Were you always so able to grasp people's attention that way? Is that a natural gift of yours?
Yeah, the last 2 days I was coaching speakers and they're talking about being nervous and everything. And I'm like, gosh, I hate to say this, but I've never been nervous speaking. I was speaking once in front of a crowd. The biggest crowd I ever spoke in front of was 5,500 people. And I had my Michael Corleone moment where I looked down at my hands and my hands were steady as a rock. And I'm like, wow, I'm not nervous at all. This is where I'm supposed to be. But I love it. I love, the big thing for me is just getting people in a positive mindset, too much negativity in the world. You and I, it looks like, have a shared passion. My wife and I are going hiking in the mountains right after this.
That's awesome. Where do you live? Sorry.
I live in Denver now. We also have a place in Los Angeles. I'm actually glad we're in Denver now because our place in LA, we would have been in a high density area with all kinds of nonsense.
Yeah.
And here there's tons of space. You're still allowed to hike in the mountains. It's really nice.
Denver's a beautiful area too.
Yeah. Where in Boston are you?
Right by the airport. I'm in Riviera on the beach. So I've got the mountains and the ocean. Those are my two.
Right. My dad used to be the director of the Medfield Public Library. My folks lived in Franklin.
Interesting. So you've got your Boston connection too.
Yeah, I do. And I love it. We'd go out in the summer. We'd always go out to Provincetown on the Cape. It was always, I love it. I just love the attitude in Massachusetts. It's fun.
It's different, especially from LA, where we're more likely to say something mean to your face and something nice behind your back, which I think is about the opposite of what you get in LA.
That's exactly what I tell people. I'm like, the difference between my New York friends and my LA friends, my New York friends will be like, hey, Danny, that jacket, ugliest jacket I've ever seen. I wouldn't be caught dead in that jacket. Whereas my friends in LA would be like, wow, what a nice jacket. Can you believe he's wearing that jacket? Exactly. It's like, there's always this misunderstanding for the East Coast attitude. I'm like, no, it's honesty. It's different.
Exactly. Yeah, I used to be, back in the day, I was in software consulting, and I was sitting around a whole table of people in LA, and we were all talking about this and that. And the first person to get up and, leave the table, like the second that, you could start to see their back, it was like, everybody was talking about that person. I thought,
oh,
note to self, don't go to the ladies' room during this conversation. It's just like, wow. Yeah. So what's your background, Danny? I mean, I know that you've done a lot of teaching and stuff. Did you do that right out of the gate, right out of college?
No, I worked for a congressman, which I always tell people in high school, I cleaned toilets at a health club. And in college, I worked for a congressman. If I ever had the choice to do one or the other, I would much rather clean toilets than ever work on Capitol Hill again. You talk about nasty people. It wasn't really the elected officials. It was the staffers were just always, it was so negative. But then I became a journalist, and so I got to cover the 92 election. I covered President Bush, and I had a great time. But I had become, I wanted to be a journalist because I wanted to be the next Charles Kuralt. And I wanted to go around America and do all these great profile pieces. And the president was giving a speech, and I wrote my lead, and I saw the 6 leads my colleagues had written. And I was like, wow, he didn't say anything that was nasty. And you've all just ripped him apart. And I was like, I don't want to be a part of this. Because I get that you can't be objective as a journalist. I get that, but you can be fair. I mean, if a person, don't misconstrue what a person's saying. And I just don't like the negativity. And so it's funny, a friend told me, I had a job offer to work at the Chicago Tribune for $16,500 a year as a city beat reporter. And then I got an offer to teach in inner city LA for $25,000 a year. And so I always tell people I became a teacher for the noblest of reasons, for the high pay. But now I look at it and I'm like, wow, that was probably a pretty good decision. A lot of people don't know the statistics, but since I graduated college, the number of beat reporters in the United States that have been laid off is the equivalent of the population of Orlando.
Wow.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Wow.
And so people, and now when people talk about fake news, I'm like, well, you got bloggers, but an actual journalist, they're just doing their job. There's no real thing as fake news. There's people that rely on one news source, which you're crazy if you only rely on one news source. You should be reading different newspapers and watching different, I mean, I watch the BBC all the time because it's really the only news offer to us that actually gives more of an international perspective as opposed to just an American-centric perspective.
Yeah.
And then I was teaching, and my wife and I attended a real estate seminar, and turned out to be a scam. We bought 10 properties in one weekend. We lost everything, and I could focus on all the negatives, but I'm a positive person. So I look at, it was such a blessing because my wife is my partner for life because I put her through hell. I'm no longer tight with money because I realize easy come, easy go. I try not to judge other people because if I was somebody looking at what I did, I'd say, oh, you deserve that. And I'm like, but we didn't do it with the wrong intentions. And I realize if you don't know everything about a person, you really don't know anything about a person. I became a Christian, which I'm still not thrilled to tell people that's what happened to me. But I'm like, after I read my Bible, I'm not the first screw up to find Jesus. But the thing that really changed my life, Chris, was my accountant told me, well, you're going to have to file for bankruptcy if you don't make this much more money. And I didn't really want to file for bankruptcy. I eventually had to, and that's another story. But for years, I fought it. And so in order to supplement my income, I started speaking. And that first year, I hit the number that he gave me. Well, then the next year, he gave me a much higher number, and I hit that number. And so the third year, I thought, well, maybe I should set a higher number. And so really, basically during one of the worst economic downturns in American history, I built up a speaking business, which far exceeded what I was making as an educator. And now I get to, now it's just crazy. Now I have this online, the speaking business has suffered from COVID, but COVID may have been the greatest thing ever to happen to me because I have an online reading engagement program, which now is exploding all over the world because millions of parents are forced to involuntarily homeschool their kids.
Yeah, and I wanted to talk about that because nobody had time to prepare themselves, teachers and people who are now going to have to educate their kids and be much more, never mind that you're trying to work while your kid's trying to go to school, while your, spouse is trying to do whatever they're trying to do, and all the distraction and stuff like that, and the lack of downtime and from your family and stuff. But teachers, I would think that it's much more challenging for a teacher who, to try to teach in a way, in this sort of environment when they have no experience doing that.
Yeah, it's a totally different skill set. Even the last 2 days I was coaching speakers, and speakers all have to adapt because I'm like, if you think there's going to be a lot of public events, everybody's been saying, oh, the public events are going to just come back. They're going to be stronger than ever. And I'm like, and I believe in the Easter Bunny too. I just don't think that's the truth. I think that there's a huge shift right now. And regardless of when we actually have public events, you need to start getting used to doing Zoom meetings and virtual. And it's a different skill set. Like, how do you frame yourself in the frame? What's behind you? One of the speakers had like a bathroom door open and his kids were going to the bath. And I'm like, people can see that. You're on TV. some people are wearing their underwear. I'm like, people can see you, just so you know.
I know.
So it's funny. It's a shift, and it's for educators. When we moved to Colorado, so my wife wanted to move because women are much smarter than men. She's looking long term. We have 3 kids, and she wanted all of our kids to be able to buy their own houses and live near us. Well,
Not in LA.
California's crazy,
Yeah.
crazy real estate market. You're a realtor, so it'd be like Boston, another real estate market that's crazy.
Yeah.
So she had this long criteria of where we could move to, and I had a very small, my criteria was, well, we had to be in a place next to a major airport so I can fly easily to speaking gigs, and we need to be in the best school district in the state because I want the kids in a good school. Well, my wife, her list was very long. Her first criteria was, well, it can't be humid. And I said, well, that just eliminated 80% of the United States.
Yeah.
And then there can't be bugs. I'm like, well, that just eliminated another 10% of the United States. And I said, well, because I grew up in Durango, Colorado, and Southwest Colorado. And I said, well, Colorado is a dry state. And because of the altitude, you don't have that many bugs. Yeah. And it's turned out to just be a total blessing. But that was a very long story to get to a very short point. My kids are in the best school district in Colorado, it's Cherry Creek School District, which I think had the worst possible response to COVID. They said, oh, we're going to use asynchronous learning, which they love to use fancy terms. That's a real indicator to me when a person doesn't know what they're doing or what they're talking about. When they like to use vocabulary that's exclusionary, give it to me in plain English.
Exactly. If you don't know what asynchronous learning is, well, the emperor has new clothes, right?
Exactly. And it was they were talking down to me, and I can't even, here I am, I'm a Ph.D. in education. They're talking down to me. Can you imagine that poor parent, like you get like an immigrant parent? And I was disgusted by the response they gave to me because basically they've also misdefined what asynchronous learning is. They say their policy was on Monday that the teachers would assign a whole bunch of homework for the week to the kids. They'd send them to Khan Academy online, and then once a week, the teachers would meet with the entire class on Zoom for half an hour so the kids could see one another. That is not education. And you're never going to find a stronger advocate for public education than me, Chris. But they made a great argument for why we don't need school teachers. If all you're going to do is send the kids to Khan Academy, and I'm not putting down Khan Academy because I think Khan Academy has some great stuff to it, but it's not the end-all be-all. And as a matter of fact, anybody that ever tells you anything is the end-all be-all is wrong, because that's the interesting thing about education is every kid is different. And that's when you're dealing with superior leadership, is when they recognize there's no one right way. There's 36 different ways to get through to different families, different kids, different needs of the students. And that's one of the other things that drives me nuts when they talk about, oh, I have a special needs student. I'm like, every child has special needs, just so you know that. Every child is gifted and talented if you treat them like they're gifted and talented. There's nothing that bugs me more than that. And so I've actually worked with some of the lowest income school districts in America that have actually had an amazing response. Some of these school districts have made sure that every kid has a laptop, every kid has Wi-Fi, that they're online. They were online getting instruction at least 4 hours a day, 4 days a week, and then they were getting individual counseling from teachers. That's a very thorough plan, but it goes right back to your point, Chris. This is a whole new skill set for teachers. It's not like this is what teachers were trained to do. Now, I believe that you can train them to do that. It's the same thing as being a realtor. It's being trained in a hot market is very different than being trained in a cold market. And you have to learn how to adjust, but training is involved.
Yeah, it's true. It's amazing. I'm just thinking about your asynchronous learning business. Like you say, okay, well, I guess we don't need any of you next year. We're cutting or slashing the budget, my God, that's just, that's homeschooling, basically.
It is. And plus it's also, don't confuse it. Because what true asynchronous learning would be so one school district I work with, what they did is they'd have, so let's say the 5th grade department had 5 different teachers. And so what each teacher was responsible for was to videotape 4 15-minute lessons a week. And so now every kid has 20 15-minute lessons from that department. Now that's different than just saying, we'll go to Khan Academy. They got a lesson on fractions. I mean, well, I have no relationship with that teacher. I mean, there's no individualized instruction there. That's a total cop out. And I was disgusted. And and then Cherry Creek said, well, we can't do the video thing because of equity. They love to use words. Oh, equity. We need equity. Chris, this is a school district where I'm going to go out on a limb and guess that 95% of the kids, their families are making a very significant income. There might be 5%. I'll go crazy and say maybe there's 10%. I don't even think it's 10%. But I mean, I've worked with school districts right now that it's 99% low income, and they've had a better response. But it was, this is a blessing. I hope that people actually, unfortunately, we're in a politicized society right now where people don't actually look at issues. But if you want the bigger conversation, even my wife, who's married to an educator, she didn't realize what was going to happen. I said, when COVID started, I'm like, honey, this is going to be catastrophic. And she's like, why? People can just do this and this. I'm like, okay, just so you know, there's going to be about 15 million kids that don't have Wi-Fi access or a computer at home. I guarantee you there's even a larger number of those kids that they're going to be home alone because their parents are forced to work day laboring jobs to earn income. And here's the real dirty little secret. I'm going to tell you that I'll be generous and say it's just about 15 million, but it's probably more like 20 to 30 million kids. The reason they go to school is to eat. And it's disgusting. This is the richest country in the world. And, we have these political arguments about healthcare and education, basic needs. And I'm like, why is this an argument? Why is this politicized? Or like the environment? Like, this is not a political thing. This is something that all of us, as not just Americans, as human beings, should be concerned about. But at a very basic level, I think every kid should have a fair opportunity to an education. I think that there was a great, when Schwarzenegger was the governor of California, there was a great op-ed in the San Francisco Chronicle, and it begged Governor Schwarzenegger to declare every 5-year-old in California a prisoner. Because if they were all declared prisoners, they would all have access to health care. They would all get 3 meals a day. They would have access to library resources that they don't have in their public schools. And I'm like, wow, isn't that just a sad commentary on America when the prisoners have it better than the kindergartners?
Yeah, absolutely, boy. So one of the things that I saw of you, you were getting folks to repeat after you. And first you did it in different levels, and then you did it with singing. And I just want to hear what you think the role of music is in learning.
It's everything, Chris. I mean, gosh, you got me. Now I'm going to have to tell a personal story. So this is why it's a big need. I was talking about special needs earlier because I was a special needs student for many years in school, but because I stuttered, and we moved several times, and finally there was a teacher that found me, and it was basically like the King's Speech. She would sing things to me and I would sing them back, and I gradually lost my stutter and I became a swan. But what I actually shared that, gosh, it's funny you'd ask that, because I was speaking to a school in India recently, and the kids were asking about me. And I shared that story, and I said, well, here's why I want you all to listen to this story. Was they labeled me stupid. They made fun of me because I couldn't speak. And now I get paid ridiculous sums of money to go around the world doing what for a living? Speaking. And the point to the kids is, don't let anybody tell you what you cannot do. Exactly. And that's really why I love being a teacher, is being able to see that spark in a kid's eye. I mean, I became a teacher when I realized Oprah had a teacher that believed in her. and gave her the confidence, you know, and every time I'm looking at my students, I'm like, well, there's the next Oprah, there's the next president, there's the next really good parent. And I had something to do with that. So that's where it's rewarding. But music is, you know, I sing, when I'm training schools, a lot of people say, well, because I've taught all age levels. I started off with high school, then I did middle school, upper elementary, lower elementary. My passion is the little ones because they don't know what they can't do yet. And they're just amazing. If I was president, my entire cabinet would be kindergartners and first graders. They look at the world in a totally different way. And it's a neat way. It's really neat. And so people at the trainings, they'll say, well, would you ever sing with your middle school and high school students? And I'm like, I'll give you a secret. I actually sang more often with my middle school and high school students, you know, and people ask why. I'm like, why? Because they hated it. You know, they're like, man, this is stupid, man. I hate singing this song, man. You wore that jacket yesterday, man. I'm like, my middle schoolers always get personal with me. And then the one day we don't sing, they're like, hey, when we singing, man? You know, and that was I had, so I taught 8th grade special education, which was not special education. It was 16 boys that nobody else wanted to teach. It was 8 African-American, 8 Latino, and if their life wasn't miserable enough, they got the white dude as the teacher, and the white dude liked to sing all the time, and they hated one another, but more than that, they hated their teacher because he made them sing. And after about 3 weeks, they were sick of him, and so they decided to write their own song and sing it to their teacher. And so the song they taught me was to the beat of This Old Man, but theirs was called This Old Pimp, and it was to teach me Ebonics. And so it was like, this old pimp, he played one, he says gap, but we say gun with a knick-knack. This is whack, give your dog a bone. This old pimp went rolling home. This old pimp, he played two, he says kicks, but we say shoe with a knick-knack. This is whack, give your dog a bone. This old, I mean, and I was in tears, and they're like, man, you crying, this is lame, you're lame. But the point of the story was, they were laughing together, and these guys that had hated each other and hated being in my class, we had this moment together, and from that point on, that's when we started learning. And it's something I'm a big believer in. I take my job seriously. I don't take myself seriously because I ain't all that, and neither are you. And if you think you're all that, teach kindergarten for 1 week, and those little ones will set you. I mean, I had a little girl once, LaShonda raises her hand. She's like, Miss Brassell, when are you going to trim your nose hair? And I'm like, this afternoon. Thanks for bringing that to my attention, LaShonda. I ain't all that.
You get through the rest of the class, then you'd be like, okay, now.
I know, I look like Hitler with my finger under my nose.
It's funny though, kids think that kind of stuff. Oh man, it's
Kids
so
are,
funny.
you know, I always tell people, kids are brilliant. And in one of my talks, I talk about this. The 2 most profound questions I've ever been asked by human beings were asked by little kids. So I had a 5-year-old Maria. She raises her hand and she sweetly asked me in her little voice, like, Mr. Brassell, where does it say Humpty Dumpty is an egg? And I laugh. And then I reread Humpty Dumpty, and I'm like, it doesn't. Nowhere in that nursery rhyme does it ever say Humpty Dumpty's an egg. But there's always the picture of an egg.
Picture, exactly. You need the picture.
How did I miss that all those times? You know, I have Tyrell, a 6-year-old. When I was teaching first grade, Tyrell raises his hand. He's like, Miss Brassell, is Curious George a monkey or an ape? And I laughed at him until I reread the book. So I'm rereading Curious George, and the man with the yellow hat, he always calls Curious George my little monkey. Well, where's his tail? Curious George doesn't have a tail because he's not a monkey. He's a chimpanzee. I've read that book 3,000 times, missed it every time. Tyrell, first time, got it. That's why if I'm ever murdered, I want a first grader on the scene, not my wife. You know, a first grader would be like, he's approximately 6 feet tall, dark jacket, dark pants. My wife would be like, I don't know. I think he's about this tall. I think he's white. You know, I mean, kids notice everything.
And his nose hair needed to be trimmed.
Yeah, exactly.
Look for a perpetrator with long nose hair.
It's the truth. It's the truth. Those kids, though, they pick up stuff. And any parent listening to this podcast will know this. It's the time your quiet little kid that's in the back seat. Somebody cuts you off and you say a bad word. All of a sudden you hear the bad word from the back seat. They know. They just know. And they're brilliant. I get a kick out of them, and they make me laugh. They're goofy, and it depresses me when you see. So I'm going to go back to India. I was speaking to a school in Tamil Nadu in Chennai, 5,000 girls. And so these two girls come up to me after the speech, both seniors. One wants to be a doctor, one wants to be a lawyer. I'm like, that's great. Are you going to go to university here, or maybe you'll go to Britain or into the United States? Like, oh, we can't leave here. We're girls. I'm like, get back in that auditorium. So I got them all back in, and I'm like, now is your moment, ladies. You know, within the next 5 years, India is going to become the largest country on the planet in terms of population. I'm like, you're a very young democracy, only around 70 years old, yet you've already elected a woman prime minister. America still has not elected a woman president. I'm like, right now, there are twice as many women in India as there are people in the United States. There are actually more women in India with a graduate degree than there are people in the United States. I'm like, you just made it my mission to make sure all of you get whatever you want in life. I mean, it's something I always tell my students. I'm like, sometimes you need somebody else to believe in you before you believe in yourself. I believe in all my students because they only give me the best and the brightest. You know, get those kids in a believer's mindset. But it's the same. You know, I always tell people I started off working with the high schoolers, but my passion's with the little ones. I found what works with a 12th grader does not necessarily work with a kindergartner, but what works with a kindergartner works with all age levels. When I do corporate trainings and I get attitude from executives, I'm like, we're singing for the next 2 hours unless you start playing ball. That gets them straightened out pretty quick.
Those same kind of threats. No, or you're coming up to the stage and you're going to be the one doing the singing. Mm-hmm. We'll shame you into it.
Absolutely. That's right.
So I mean, I think with children, maybe, I mean, you've somewhat just answered the question that I want to know how you get people excited about learning, and not just kids. How do you get adults to kind of unlock all those, you know, I know this, preconceived, you know, notions and stuff like that. When you're dealing with teachers, I would think I already know how to teach, right? So how do you unlock that and open that mind?
Yeah, so it was UCLA basketball coach John Wooden said it. He said, it's the things you learn after you know it all that make the most difference. And I've always told people, I'm like, there's a word for people that know it all. It's called a critic. They don't ever contribute to anything. Exactly. I'll tell people, I'm like, you know, I've never had a person 6 months after one of my presentations come up to me and say, you know what I loved about your talk, Danny, was that one PowerPoint slide where you had 18 bullet points that nobody could read because the font was so small. But people remember when we sing, people remember when they laugh, people remember when they interact with one another. And I've always thought that good teaching, you know, you're in the Boston area, one of my idols, I always poke fun at him, but I'm poking fun at him because I idolize him, is now I think he's a professor emeritus at Harvard by the name of Howard Gardner. And Howard Gardner talked about how all of us have multiple intelligences. Some of us are more verbal, and some of us are more, you know, we're good with pictures, and some of us are better with nature. And some of us, we got to be touching everything. And while every teacher is instructed in that, they never model it. It's amazing to me how they don't do it. One of my talks, I talk about differentiated instruction. Well, I've been to more than dozens of trainings on differentiated instruction. I always think it's ironic that the instructor never differentiates their instruction. You know, you need to understand that people learn in different ways. And so every time I'm creating a talk, I'm going to get you drawing, I'm going to get you dancing, I'm going to get you singing, I'm going to get you interacting with other people. You know, I'm trying to think of how do people think differently. It's kind of like when you're in sales, in real estate. So you have your we'll go stereotypical. We'll have the married couple. Well, the guy, he's interested in, how much is it going to cost me? How much is it going to cost me? And the wife, she's interested in the story you talk. Oh, but the family that lived here before, they grew, you know, they want to know the emotional part of it. I mean, that's being stereotypical, but people learn in different ways. Different things capture us. You'll see it in politics too. I think it was President Reagan may have been the first president to do it, but I guarantee you every president after him has done this. If you ever watch the State of the Union, the way the presidents used to always give the State of the Union, they'd say, you know, I've created 4 million jobs, and you know, there's 12 million people now with health care. They don't do that anymore. The way they do it now, and I believe it was started with President Reagan, is President Reagan would say, you know, up in the gallery right there is Tom Hopkins. Tom, stand up. Everybody wave to Tom. Tom is a worker at the Ford factory in Akron, Ohio. And because of our jobs program, not only did Tom's salary raise, but he's been able to put his son in college. I mean, it's a great strategy. And they always, you know, they always said that 1 million people dead is a statistic and 1 person dead is a tragedy. It's I mean, actually, so right now we have a perfect example of that is the George Floyd incident.
Yes, exactly.
This is blown up.
Yeah.
And it's humbling. It's interesting how these things, how it sometimes it only takes one. Actually, that's a great book, a children's book. I always read with, I have it. This is a book all of your listeners should read. One by Catherine Otoshi. It's about this color, blue. Blue was a quiet color. He enjoyed looking up at the sky, floating on the waves, and on days he felt daring, splashing in rain puddles. Every once in a while, he wished he could be more sunny like yellow or bright like green, more regal like purple or outgoing like orange, but overall he liked being blue, except when he was with Red. Red was a hothead. He liked to pick on Blue. Red is a great color. He'd say, red is hot, blue is not. Then Blue would feel bad about being blue. Sometimes Yellow comforted Blue. Blue's a very nice color, she'd say, but Yellow never said that in front of Red. She never said, stop picking on Blue. Green, purple, and orange thought Blue was nice too, but they never told Red to stop either. Well, one day, one shows up, and Red is picking on Blue, and one's like, you can't talk that way to Blue. And all of a sudden, Yellow's like, yeah, you can't talk that way to Blue. And Green's like, yeah, you can't talk that way. And now Red starts to feel bad. They're like, no, we don't want you to feel bad, but if you're going to be part of our group, you're going to be nice to everybody. And so they all leave as a nice group. And the last line in the book is, sometimes all it takes is one. And I'm like, everybody needs to read this book.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
It is. I mean, this is why I tell
right?
the book, and I wanted to give all of your listeners a copy of my book, Read, Lead, and Succeed. So it was a book. I wrote it for a principal who didn't know how to engage his faculty, and so I said, okay, I'll write you a book. And so once a week, I give you a concept, I give you an inspirational quote, an inspirational story, a book recommendation on a book you should read, but you're probably too lazy. So I also give you a children's picture book that demonstrates the same concept. I think the best wisdom comes from the children's books, and so I used to start all of my kindergarten classes with a read aloud, but I would do the same thing with, I always tell people the first book I read to my kindergartners is The Adventures of Tom Sawyer by Mark Twain. The first book I'd read to my 12th graders was Oh, the Places You'll Go by Dr. Seuss. Great literature has no grade level. Right. I mean, some of the best lessons you can learn are in children's picture books. And so I actually now have, it's great, a company I was speaking for a couple of months ago. The CEO he just wrote me a quick email. He's like, I'll be damned. I started a meeting with a picture book, and everybody was laughing and paying attention for the first time ever. And I'm like, well, there you go. So again, the long answer to your short question is the way you engage adults is the same way you engage little kids. You spark their curiosity. You get them. You don't accept. I won't accept non-participation. And actually, one of the points it's a serious. I try not to get too serious with people. I think life needs a lot more lightening up. But when I ask people to get partners, there's always at least one person that has no partner. And I always just tell people, pause. I'm like, this is a serious point. If you look at all these school shootings in America, there was a common element among all these people. It was lone gunmen, and that's something a teacher should have spotted, because you could have prevented that by making sure that kid had a friend. I'm like, you should never let somebody be off on their own. That's all of our responsibility, whether we're a parent. I mean, this is, when I was a kid, I'm starting to sound more and more like an old guy. I'm like, when I was a kid, my neighbor, if they saw me screwing around, they'd smack me across the face. Nowadays you get sued for that, but I'm like, but there used to be a communal,
community.
We're all raising each other's kids.
Exactly.
I mean, we can put, maybe you shouldn't smack the kid, but I mean, there was something to be said about they were willing to step in. And now nobody wants to take responsibility for anything. It's everybody else's fault. My favorite speaker of all time was Jim Rohn, and Jim Rohn used to always say, "Oh, you just need lists." I'd make a list. Whoa, the reason I'm not doing well is because of my boss, and the reason I'm not doing well is because of the government, and it's the weather. And I showed my list to my mentor, and he said, "Oh, there's something missing from your list." He's like, "What?" He's like, "You." He's right. That's the last person most of us blamed.
It's the only person we can control, right? I mean,
exactly
that's
right.
why it's so, that's why it's so glamorous and fun and easy to blame the neighbor and the, government and the job and the boss and all that kind of stuff, because what can you do about it? Nothing.
Yeah, exactly. It's real easy.
Yeah. I feel like, and this is a kind of a detour from our usual conversation, because normally this is, about financial independence and long life, right? So we a lot of times are speaking to folks who are investors and whatever, but not everybody, the majority of people are referencing a book that they read. They're referencing something some type of encounter that they had with something that someone else created that got them on their journey, that helped them to find, oh, I read this book and that book, and it really changed my perception, it changed my thinking. And I know reading is a big passion of yours. Was that always the case? Were you a bookworm as a child?
Not at all, Chris. I told you earlier, my father was a librarian, and I hated reading growing up. I hated public libraries. They were always smelly. I didn't like the furniture was uncomfortable. There was always some elderly woman telling me to be quiet. There's always some freaky guy that thinks he's a vampire hanging out by the bookshelves. I always hated public libraries. It really wasn't until I started teaching in the inner city and saw that my kids didn't have any of the resources that I had growing up. I felt very humbled that, wow, shame on me. I mean, I had both parents were in my home. Mom was a homemaker and dad worked at the library, but supper was always at 6. We were lower middle class, but we didn't want for anything. We were fine. We had tons of books in the home. I never read them. My favorite reading material growing up was TV Guide. But once I saw that the kids weren't reading, and that's what I always stress to people. I'm like, kids aren't stupid. They don't see us reading, they're never going to read. When I grew up in the 80s, I remember there was this great anti-drug ad where it's this dad and he finds his son has some pot and he's like, "Where'd you learn how to do this? Where'd you learn it?" And the kid finally's had enough. He's like, "You, Dad, I learned it from you." And all the dad backs away. And I'm like, that's I used to have a nonprofit called Real Dads Read. And I used to have all these dads in the room. I'm like, "Hey, Dad, you want to know why your kids like football so much? It's because that's the only time you spend with them. If you spent your time reading with them, they'd be readers." My pastor has a great line. He says, "Parents, you have the greatest home field advantage in the history of the planet. You could be the worst parent ever, and your kid doesn't know it. To them, you're mom or dad." And so reading became a big deal to me. I needed to model it, and I needed to make it fun. And so even when we come across books that are lame, we turn that into a fun activity. Even like my own kids, like we'll start reading a lame book and they'll say, "This is kind of lame." And so to make it interesting, every page they'll give me a different voice that I'm supposed to do. They're like, "Do it like a pirate." I'm like, "Arr, once upon a time." They're like, "Do it like a baby," and we make it fun that way. But that's another thing I always tell people is if the kid doesn't like the book, get rid of that book. Get something that they like to read. Miss McLean in 11th grade made me read The Scarlet Letter about Hester Prynne having to wear an A on her chest for committing adultery. And I wanted to wear a B on my forehead because it was the most boring book I've ever read in my life, and I wanted to kill myself. And the thing that was genius about her was she was willing to pay attention to me. And so she started letting me read what I wanted to read. And I became a pretty good reader because I always was a fairly good reader. I just didn't like it. And that's why I created my online reading engagement program. Was I always tell teachers and parents, I'm like, what good is it teaching a kid how to read if they never want to? I teach kids why to read. I've never had to tell my kids go watch TV. I've never had to tell my kids go play a video game. And I never want to ever have to tell my kids go read a book. I want them to do it because they enjoy it. And so that's the psychology behind it. So you have your audience is usually people interested in financial investments and financial independence and everything, but all you have to do is study the most successful people in the world. I mean, Warren Buffett, he goes into his office every day at like 8 in the morning, and all he does all day is read. He reads everything until 5 or 6 at night. That's what he does all the time. You know, one of the most successful businessmen on the planet. You know,
Bill
Andrew
Gates too.
Carnegie.
I think Bill Gates, what does he read, a book a day or something like that?
Bill Gates is, yeah, I mean, Elon Musk, I just read his biography by Vance, was phenomenal. He's crazy. I mean, the guy, well, because he was kind of a loner as a kid, and so that's what he did. Is he spent all this? I think he read every book in the library, and he still reads a couple of books a day. He's fascinating. And the other thing that was interesting, because I've done lots of books on research on successful people, and I always say that readers are not necessarily leaders, but the most effective leaders are always avid readers. I mean, you see it across the board. And note that I said the most effective leaders. Just because you have the term leader doesn't mean you are a leader. But the effective ones read voraciously. And then the other thing that was interesting in my research was over half of the Fortune 500 CEOs are dyslexic. And that was fascinating. And this is another thing I always tell people is, just understand that every reading disability is curable. There's ways to work on these things. And there's, Richard Branson's dyslexic, George Washington was dyslexic, Tom Cruise, Sylvester Stallone's dyslexic. I mean, you find them in all kinds of different things. You're in Boston. I was doing a whole bunch of research on Bill Belichick. He's known to have the most incredible library of football books ever assembled. Maybe that's why he's the greatest coach ever. I mean, I can't stand the Patriots, drives me nuts, but I also understand that this guy set the bar. I mean, they're going to have to rename the trophy after him. He's the guy, but he reads voraciously about this. And that's what I wrote in my book, Leadership Begins with Motivation. This is a book I just came out with, and it's just a collection of positive stories. And that's the way I always got the kids excited is I grew up listening to Paul Harvey on the radio at 12:15 every day. He'd be like, I'm Paul Harvey with the rest of the story. And I was always inspired. And I want kids to hear those stories about, well, here's a person who started off with nothing and they read, and this is where they are today. People need to hear those stories. And so to those people in your audience that are, a lot of them might not be readers, but you also have to understand the research is very clear about this. It's just as good being read aloud to as reading on your own. So if you get Audible, you can listen to books on tape. I mean, I guarantee you, Boston, if you're commuting, it's going to take you a couple hours every day in your car. So you might as well.
Right now. Woohoo, smooth sailing.
I know COVID. See, another benefit of COVID. Let's look at all the benefits of COVID. But that's a great opportunity if you're spending even just an hour a day in your car 5 days a week. I mean, it's almost, about 280 hours a year you could be listening to books. I mean, not bad. I mean, college is 15 units a semester. You're basically getting almost a college degree just every year listening to your books on tape. And I was just named. I'm now the dean of the Constantinople School in Islamabad, Pakistan. And
wow, congratulations!
I get to do this, and so I was just speaking to the kids, and I was telling them, I'm like, you are what you read, so read good stuff. If you want to be positive, read about people that have had some inspirational journeys. If you want to be miserable and negative, read the newspaper. It's the most freakiest thing you can read every single day. But you want to feed yourself with good things. Again, Jim Rohn was one of the mentors I had that he just had a huge impact on my life, because that's how he used to start his day. Was he'd read the newspaper and he'd be in a bad mood because he's reading about all these horrible things. And so then he started reading like the Bible, or he'd read something inspirational or positive. And that's what you need to feed yourself. I mean, if you want to be a successful realtor, you read about things that are going to put you on track to be successful. I mean, I think Tom Hopkins, I'm sure you're familiar with Tom Hopkins. He's like one of the most, but the guy sold like a house a day for a full year, 360. How do you do that? I mean, most realtors maybe sell 1 or 2 a year. This guy sold 365 houses, but he was constantly reading to improve himself and feeding his brain with positive things, and he was listening to books on tape in the car. So that's what your audience will benefit from, is if you really want to succeed, hang around successful people. And, Napoleon Hill talks about it in Think and Grow Rich. Your mentors don't have to be people you physically met. Abraham Lincoln can be a mentor of yours because you can read what Abraham Lincoln. I mean, I've never met Gandhi, but I've read voraciously on Gandhi and Mandela. I mean, and I always tell these stories to the kids. I tell them, I'm like, Nelson Mandela, how did this guy live on this planet? I don't know. The guy's in jail for 27 years. He gets out and everybody's like, okay, here comes the vengeance. The guy forgives everybody. How do these people live on this planet? I'm like, I need to get thinking like that. Or Abraham Lincoln becomes president of the United States. He takes all of his political rivals and makes them his cabinet. It would be the equivalent of Donald Trump naming Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State. This is what Lincoln did. And all these guys hated Lincoln's guts. And by the time he was assassinated, they were all inconsolable. They're like, we've lost the greatest leader of all time. Lincoln had one of my favorite quotes of any leader. He said, I know the best way to defeat my enemies. I shall make them my friends. Wow. Where's that thought process? I want kids to start thinking like that. How do we get there? How do we get there?
Absolutely. Well, didn't it used to be that if two people ran against each other, that one would be president and the other would automatically be vice president,
I think
right?
the first 5 or 6 elections was Secretary vice president.
That's a great idea, because you don't want a whole bunch of automatrons that are thinking the way you think. Like Lincoln knew, you want a bunch of different opinions, people who disagree with you, because otherwise how are you going to grow?
I have a better idea. I think that the way we should elect all officials is the 8th caller to the radio station. Whoever the 8th caller is, that's the senator, that's the congressman, that's the president. Guys like, you're now the president of the United States. Well, do I still get the Def Leppard tickets? Yeah, but you're also leader of the free world. Okay. If you did that, though, people, I laugh about it, but I'm like, actually, there's precedent for that. That's basically how the Greeks did the Senate. It was like jury duty, and if you do that, you take money out of politics, because now you're just forced to do it, and you're focused on just solving the problem, and you're not there for the rest of your life. You're there for a couple of years.
Right.
So there's all kinds of benefits to that.
Yeah, it just depends, I guess, what radio station they're calling into for that.
That's right. Classical versus hard rock.
Exactly. Oh. So tell me how you think, it seems to me, not being in education, not having kids, not knowing Jack, but it seems that so much of education now is focused on just passing tests. And that can't have had a good, how do you feel about that whole?
Disgusted by it, Chris. It's a great question. I mean, if we got rid of all standardized testing in America, and if you look at it, COVID forced a lot of states to get rid of their standardized testing, but you would save taxpayers $5 billion a year if you got rid of standardized testing, and then you could reinvest that money into school counselors and to PE and to art and to music and to field trips. I swear that the diagram right now for public education is the moment we find out kids like something, we have to eliminate that from the curriculum and get them back into standardized testing. And there's just no relationship between test scores and how well you're going to do in life. I used to have a presentation where I showed a picture of 3 gentlemen, but I blocked out all of their photos. I'm like, well, let's look at standardized testing right now. The guy on the left had a D- grade point average in high school. He couldn't get into a university, so he applied to City College of New York, where he boosted his grades to a C- average, taking mostly physical education courses. But he enrolled in the Army, did that for 20 years, decided to go for his master's degree in his 40s, and he got straight A's. Fortunately, Secretary of State Colin Powell wasn't judged on how he did in high school. I'm like, now the guy on the right has a very interesting distinction. He's the only person ever to be kicked out of Yale twice for bad grades. He goes to Yale, gets kicked out in 6 months. So he goes back home, falls in love. His girlfriend's parents won't let her date a college dropout. So he uses connections, gets readmitted to Yale, where he gets kicked out promptly again for bad grades. So he enrolls in that bastion of higher learning, Casper Community College, takes an interest in political science, transfers to the University of Wyoming, gets straight A's, and fortunately, Vice President Dick Cheney wasn't judged on how he did on standardized tests. I'm like, now the guy in the middle who's blocked out, I'd like to tell you how he did in school, but the moment he ran for governor of Texas, they sealed all of his transcripts from kindergarten on. They don't usually seal your transcripts because you're a straight A student. I'm like, his name was President George Bush. I'm like, this isn't political, because I'm not I can tell I'm old because I'm not really interested in politics anymore. I'm interested in solutions, not problems, and too many problems right now in politics. But here's the point. Under anybody's measure, these are three highly successful individuals. But fortunately, they weren't judged on how they did on some random standard or standardized test. And you see it all the time. I mean, and that's what we were talking about earlier. Like, there's all kinds of different types of intelligences. I mean, I'm told that Johnny Cochran, the lawyer for OJ, that if you met him and then saw him 20 years later, he'd remember your name and something about you. I'm like, wow, that's a skill.
Oh God, yeah.
I mean, but that skill is not necessarily something you see on a standardized test. I mean, I don't know what kind of student Michael Jordan was, but that guy saw a basketball court in a different way than other people. I mean, he's highly proficient at that skill. I mean, and if people don't think that's a skill, he inspired me and millions of other people to look at. I just watched that thing, The Last Dance, and I forgot how much I loved watching Michael Jordan. I'm like, gosh, he does things that humans shouldn't be able to do. So all of us have those different skill sets. And I think what a standardized test shows is how well you can do on a standardized test. That's all it's showing. I mean, think about it this way. Everybody in the audience right now, I want you to think about, did you pass your driver's test? Okay, and you're gonna say yes, probably. I'm like, okay, now I want you to think of this. Do you feel safer on the road because everybody passed a driver's test? No, all any test measures is how you did at a certain point in time. I mean, there's all kinds of variables too. I mean, maybe last night you didn't get enough sleep, or maybe you didn't eat breakfast, or maybe you found out your parents are getting a divorce. I mean, there's all kinds of variables. I mean,
Just
when
nervousness.
I taught in New York City,
people get nervous and their heads just shut off.
absolutely. And there's also bias, and it's interesting, and I always thought bias was just a crock. The people that say bias, it's because they did badly on the test. Well, then I started administering tests in the inner city, and I noticed there were some questions. I'm like, and don't get me wrong, I don't think that people intentionally write bias into their questions, but there is bias, and they don't realize it. And so there was one question, and it was a math question. It showed it took Mary 10 minutes to comb her hair, 10 hours to comb her hair, or 10 days to comb her hair. Well, I had a little girl in my class, Monique, who had spent all Saturday having her hair braided at the hairdresser. And I'm like, she may have missed that question. I noticed that all the questions, the kids were named John and Mary, whereas you never saw like Juan and Maria, or Tashawn and Lakeisha. I mean, just little things like that. I don't think somebody's intentionally, we know how to get them. But I'm like, I think there was one question that was talking about quiche. Now, I can guarantee you none of my kids have ever heard the word quiche, but the same bias would probably be present. My kids, we'd have like soul luncheons with collard greens and stuff. But if you gave that question in North Dakota, maybe those kids aren't exposed to that. So there was a geographic bias. There was a question about snow, and one of my kids sniffs, he's like, snow like cocaine? I'm like, no, snow like from the sky, man. I'm like, my gosh. But
they've seen a lot more snow than they have snow coming from the sky, right?
So again, I don't think somebody, I mean, I hope that somebody's, but I really don't think that there's somebody intentionally making that kind of bias. But all of us it kind of talks about what we were talking about when I was a journalist is, there's no real objectivity. All of us have had our own life experiences. And so it's just interesting, and the George Floyd incident is also kind of a perfect example of this. I've been basically apologizing to all my African-American friends. I'm like, I thought you'd blown this up. I always thought, this is all blown out of proportion and stuff. And now I'm like, holy cow. I thought we were so far beyond this. I realize I'm naive. I realize it was one of the best things to happen in my life, Chris, was my university required we do a semester abroad. And so I wanted to go to Spain. Well, Spain, the program that they had in Spain, it was only for graduate level economics. Well, I was an undergraduate journalism major, but I wanted to go to Spain, and I didn't speak Spanish, so I went there. And it was a great experience, Chris, because for the first time in my life, people discriminated against me. They thought I was stupid. I'm not that stupid, but I didn't speak Spanish. And I realized for the first time in my life, I'm like, wow, I was born with a whole bunch of advantages I never ever considered. I was born white, male, and American. And when I taught at USC, I taught ESL to engineering students. And a lot of people thought my students were stupid. I'm like, they're studying to be rocket scientists. They're highly intelligent. They just don't speak English very well. And it was interesting. And I'm like, huh, all of us have had those types of things. So, and I think I was being interviewed yesterday and we were talking about it. And I was like, I just think people need experiences. They need exposure. I think, I don't think there's a willing ignorance. I think just a lot of us are ignorant. Like if you're not exposed to something, it's something that you think might be dangerous because you just don't know what it is. But once you get exposed to it, you have knowledge, and that's what I hope that this whole thing. I mean, I hope that people can actually have a rational dialogue rather than just shout at one another. I mean, it's a hope. I always, but you never know. I mean, like things happen like that all the time. I mean, you have things that happen. I'll never forget this, Chris. I mean, 25 years ago, now it's almost 30 years ago, I had a fifth grader come up to me and say, Mr. Brassell, my mama says the reason they call it the White House is you got to be white to live there. And now I could say, not anymore. Isn't that incredible? I mean, that's what's amazing is, so that's why when people feel down, I'm like, yeah, it's always darkest before the light. So hopefully we'll get the light.
I hope so. I mean, actually, if you look back on some prior podcasts, we did a 3-podcast series on racism. We had a fantastic panel of Black thought leaders who were very open and very frank, in their explanations about things. Someone actually said to me recently, "Oh, how come the majority of the people that are, protesting and doing this Black Lives Matter are white?" And I felt like saying, well, because they're the only people that are surprised. Black people know that this happens all the time. Oh yeah, another poor Black guy was beat to crap by the police. What's the big deal? That's just another day. Just business as usual. So I don't think we really have any understanding. You know what I mean? Of what, and as you say, white privilege. What's it all about? Well, if you're white, you don't know what white privilege is because it's just there.
No, and I think so, and I think it's an honest ignorance. A lot of us are just we didn't know it existed. I mean, when I get pulled over by a cop, I don't think he's going to pull his gun on me.
Exactly.
And it's interesting. It's just I love that. You're right. We're white. That's why we're the ones protesting. That's true. There's a lot of truth to that statement. So I mean, that's what I've been saying right now. Here I am a speaker, but right now I got to be a listener. There's so much I don't know about, and but that turns me on. I've always loved being a student. I think when you stop learning, you stop growing, and so hopefully all of us will grow from this, and positive things will happen. That's always my hope.
Have you read the book White Fragility?
I have not. Who wrote that?
You would ask me that. I can find out because it's on my phone at the moment, but I'm reading it, and it's really a good book. She does a great job of explaining, in a very sort of gentle way, how we got here. Robin DiAngelo. Great. And I'll put a link to it. So if you come back and look at your post, you'll find a link to White Fragility.
That's great. I love that. That's well, and here I'll give you one for your listeners, because this is what you were talking about. How do you engage audiences? And so the book that really changed my life on that is called Made to Stick by Chip Heath and Dan.
Love that book. I love that book.
So Chip is a business professor at Stanford, and Dan runs an educational software company in North Carolina. And that book got me thinking about how do I get my messages, and this is what we were talking about earlier. How do you get people to remember a message? And so the book has a couple of examples, and you've read it, so you would know the answers. It's like, have you ever heard that you can see the Great Wall of China from outer space? And everybody's, oh, yeah, I've heard that. I'm like, it's completely false. The Great Wall of China is very long, but it's not wide. I mean, if that was the criteria, you could see I-95 from outer space, but for some reason, this sticks in our head. I'm like, have you ever heard you only use 10% of your brain? And people say, yes. I'm like, that's also untrue. if you get in a car accident and you have brain damage, as long as it's the 90% you're not using, you don't have to worry about it. I'm like, it's completely false. But for some reason, those stick in our heads. I always tell people, I've read the 26 words of John 3:16 about 3,000 times. And for the life of me, Chris, I cannot remember them in order. But I can watch the movie Tommy Boy once and remember dialogue verbatim. That's pathetic. But all of us have that. No, I mean, all of us have something. You know, you probably have some real estate friends that can sit there, 455 Howard Street, that sold 3 years ago at 85,000. You know, you're like, how do you remember that? There's people that can remember that stuff. And then there's people that just remember like, Tom Brady last year, he threw for 5,433 yards, 63 touchdowns. You're like, how do you remember that?
Yeah.
But all of us have that, something like that. There's something all of us are good at. And that's what I love as a teacher is I'm trying to figure out, well, what is that? And you know, and it doesn't matter what it is. I was blessed to have parents that all they ever expected from my brother, my sister, and I is that whatever we did in life, we'd be the best at it. Try our best. They always wanted you do your best. And Martin Luther King has a quote, and I always screw up the quote, but he said, you know, if you're a street sweeper, you should sweep streets like Beethoven wrote symphonies, like Michelangelo painted. You know, you should sweep the streets so well that when you are long gone, people are like, oh, here was a magnificent street sweeper. I'm like, there's a lot of truth to that. Is whatever you do, have pride in it, and never put down another person's trade, because there's beauty in what all of us can offer.
Beautiful. And that's actually a lovely way to end this. But I want to ask you just one more question, because you've touched on it a few times, and I really am curious about all your work in Pakistan and Islamabad, and how did you get involved in that?
I love it. So I was, well, again, this isn't going to sound very noble, but I was speaking in Switzerland, and I was with this a friend of mine who actually is a professor at Boston College, Andy Hargraves, and he was speaking before me. And when they were doing his introduction, they're like, oh, he's a tenured professor at Boston College, and he's also a visiting professor at the University of Nova Scotia, Cambridge, and the University of Hong Kong. And so afterwards, Andy and I are drinking together, lemonade, and I'm like, Andy, how do you get all these visiting professorships? He's like, oh, it's great. There's all these universities that in order to boost their esteem, they want American professors. And so I immediately applied and got accepted. I'm a visiting distinguished professor at the American University in Cairo in Egypt. And so I'm like, I brought my business partner, my online reading engagement program is readbetterinSixty7steps.com. I'm like, okay, we can take this to Egypt and introduce it to the Egyptian students. And so I spoke to about 15 international schools while I was there. And I had this one parent training. 400 parents showed up at 2 in the afternoon. It was an Islamic school. So it was all the guys had the long beards and all the women were in burqas. And they were talking to me like you and I are talking right now. And I thought, shame on me. I'd made a lot of I had all these preconceptions. I'm like, man, people are people. And this is when I learned these are the people I want to work with, because I started my presentation. I'm like, so I was reading this book. Have any of you ever read the Quran? And so they all laugh. And I'm like, oh, well, then you know the story. When the Archangel Gabriel first appears to Muhammad in the cave, what's his first instruction to Muhammad? Because in Islam, the first prophecy is to read. And so I said, so not only should we get your kids reading, it's actually written in your sacred scripture that it's your responsibility to get them reading. And they were all nodding, and I'm like, these are the people I need to be with. And it's great. So we've been able to really establish all these great programs. And so because of that, because of our efforts in Egypt, now we've expanded to, I'll be interviewed on Saturday for Nigerian television. We're expanding to Nigeria. And then Pakistan, I just accepted this position at Pakistan. And it's just amazing. It's something I think all Americans need to experience. We all need to just really broaden our scope of people, because you hear what people are like, but then when you meet the people are people, man. I can hang out with anybody. That's what I always love, that Will Rogers quote. He said, I never met a man I didn't like. And I'm like, no, a lot of wisdom to Will Rogers there. So,
But that's the secret, right? To meet them, not to just
yeah, to
judge from
meet them.
afar.
I mean, and I can't take credit for not being one of those people that judged afar, because I did do that. And shame on me. A lot of my preconceptions, but I'm still learning. I'm still learning. I have that open mind we talked about. We'll wrap around. That's how we started. It starts with an open mind. T. Harv Eckert, he says, your mind should be like a parachute. It works a lot better when it's open.
Sure. Absolutely. So what are you reading right now?
Right now, I'm reading a history of the Second City Improv Group in Chicago. And then I just read a great book by a Navy captain, Michael Abramoff, I think. It's called It's Your Ship. And I wrote him an email. I'm like, you should run for president of the United States. I mean, if you run the country like you run a ship. I mean, it was a wonderful book. It's so quick. Everybody listening, you should get this book. It's Your Ship. It's been around. I think it was first published in 2002. But it was so nice to read something like that. And I also read Hillbilly Elegy. Was that was interesting, reading about Appalachia. And, it's about an Appalachian kid that winds up going to Yale Law School. But it tells you about, that's one of those other things people don't realize, the dark secret. A lot of things we talk about race in this country. When I was a professor, I used to always challenge my students. I'm like, okay, if you can show me any legitimate race-based study, you get an automatic A. Because there's never been a legitimate race-based study. I'm like, what the indicator, though, usually is your socioeconomic status, your income level. And that's the deep, dark secret in America that we're seeing. And we're going to see a lot more. You're going to see it more in real estate. We're people don't realize we're in the Great Depression right now, and they don't realize it yet. There's some things happening behind the scenes that there's a lot of people that are going to lose houses very soon. I understand why people are trying to rush the kids to school. It's because they want the parents to be employed, but until we actually really understand the health consequences, these are serious issues. I pray for everybody on these. These are decisions that I'm glad I don't have to make. And that's the one thing I always remember when people like to gripe about their leaders. I'm like, well, they did something none of us did. None of us did. They actually ran.
It's really armchair quarterback is so much more rewarding of a position, because you can always
absolutely. It's what we were talking about, personal responsibility.
Absolutely.
So Chris, thank you so much for having me. And the website all of your listeners can go to, and you can put this in the notes, is freereadingtraining.com. They'll get a complimentary copy of my book, plus a couple of digital trainings I do with parents to get the kids to read more, read better, and love reading. But you're really providing a great service, and your listeners are very lucky to have you.
Oh, Danny, thank you so much. This has been a fantastic pleasure for me. And if you listeners, if you go on to the website for the podcast, which is getyourfillpodcast.com, you will find all the links, all the books we talked about today, and a link to Danny's website and other resources that we find interesting. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Chris. God bless.
God bless to you. Thank you very much. Have a super day.
You too.